While you were sleeping, the most powerful crown prince in the Arab world picked up a phone, not to call Washington, not to call London, not to call the man in the White House who had just launched the biggest American military campaign in the Middle East in over 2 decades. He called Beijing, and what was agreed in that conversation has just rewritten the security architecture of an entire region. The United States Navy has patrolled these waters for 80 years. 8 decades of aircraft carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, nuclear submarines, and the most sophisticated fighter jets ever built, keeping the peace in the Persian Gulf. And in one quiet, private conversation, Mohammed, between a crown prince and the world's rising superpower, all of that was made strategically irrelevant. This is not a story about missiles or airstrikes. This is the story of how America lost the Gulf without firing a single shot at the country that replaced it. Stay with me until the very end of this video. Because the final piece of this story, the detail that intelligence analysts in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv are still trying to process, will fundamentally change how you see everything that is happening in the world right now. Let us start from the beginning, not the beginning of this war, the beginning of the shift that made this entire moment possible. Because nothing that is happening today, the burning oil infrastructure, the closed strait, the stranded tankers, the spiking fuel prices at pumps across the world, none of it makes sense unless you understand the decade-long process that brought us here. For 80 years, there was an arrangement. It was never written down. It was never voted on by any parliament or ratified by any senate, but it was as real and as binding as any formal treaty in the history of international relations. The arrangement was simple. The United States would guarantee the security of the Gulf kingdoms. America would station its naval forces at the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. It would base its air assets at Al Udeid in Qatar, the largest American airbase in the entire Middle East. It would place troops and equipment in Kuwait, in the UAE, and Saudi Arabia itself. It would park carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf and respond to any threat, from Iran, from Iraq, from anywhere, with the full, overwhelming weight of American military power. In exchange, the Gulf kingdoms would price their most valuable commodity, the oil that powered the global economy, in United States dollars, not in euros, not in yuan, not in any other currency, in dollars. This arrangement, known as the petrodollar system, was the financial foundation of American global power. Every country on Earth that needed oil had to first acquire US dollars to buy it, which meant demand for the dollar was perpetual and structural, and the US military kept the whole system safe. That was the deal. For 80 years it worked, but arrangements only function when both sides believe in them, when both sides trust that the other will deliver. And somewhere in the decade that stretched from roughly 2015 to 2025, one side of that arrangement stopped believing. To understand why, you have to understand one man, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the man who is, for all practical purposes, already the king of the most important oil-producing kingdom on Earth. MBS is not simply a royal successor. He is a strategist. He is a man who watches, who calculates, and who acts with a cold, precise clarity about where power actually lies, versus where it merely appears to lie. And over that decade, MBS watched a series of events that told him, one by one, that American power in the Gulf was becoming selective, conditional, available when it suited Washington's interests, but not necessarily available when Riyadh's interests required it. The first signal came in 2015. Barack Obama signed the Iran nuclear deal. From the perspective of Saudi Arabia, which views Iran as its primary regional rival and existential threat, this was Washington legitimizing Tehran, rewarding Iran, treating the Islamic Republic as a negotiating partner rather than a threat to be contained. The Saudis were not consulted in any serious way. The deal happened to them, not with them, and the message embedded in that event was uncomfortable for Riyadh. American strategic priorities and Saudi strategic priorities were not the same thing. The second signal was louder. In September 2019, a swarm of drones and cruise missiles struck the Abqaiq oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia. Abqaiq is not simply an oil facility. It processes roughly 5 to 7% of the entire world's daily oil supply. It is the single most economically critical piece of energy infrastructure on the planet. In one night, the attack cut Saudi production in half. Oil prices spiked overnight. The global economy shuddered, and the United States did nothing. Washington issued statements. Washington sent a few additional Patriot missile batteries. Washington pointed fingers at Iran, but there was no military response. No retaliation, no consequence for Tehran, nothing. Absolutely nothing. MBS looked at that response, or rather that absence of a response, and he understood something that no American official would publicly admit. The U.S. security guarantee had a threshold. Below that threshold, you were on your own. And the threshold was higher than Saudi Arabia had been led to believe. Those two events alone would have been enough to prompt a strategic reassessment. But they were not alone. They were part of a pattern. The American pivot toward Asia, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the rhetorical pivot away from the Middle East across 3 consecutive administrations. that the United States was looking eastward toward China, toward the Indo-Pacific, toward the great power competition of the 21st century. And MBS, sitting in Riyadh, watching all of this, drew the logical conclusion. If America is pivoting away, and if the security guarantee has conditions I cannot fully predict, then I need an insurance policy. I need a backup. I need a relationship with another major power that has its own reasons to keep Saudi Arabia stable and prosperous. And there was only one candidate for that role: China. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China did not begin as a military one. It grew from an economic one, and it grew slowly, carefully, and with extraordinary strategic patience. China is Saudi Arabia's single largest customer for crude oil. Every year, China buys more Saudi oil than any other country on earth. Chinese refineries are built specifically to process Saudi crude. Saudi Aramco has invested billions of dollars in Chinese refinery projects to lock in that customer relationship for decades. The flow of Saudi oil to Chinese factories is not a transaction. It is a structural dependency that links the economic survival of the world's largest manufacturer to the energy reserves of the world's largest oil producer. These two countries do not just trade with each other, they need each other in a deep, daily, irreplaceable way. When economic relationships reach that scale, they begin to generate their own gravity. They pull political relationships in their direction. And political relationships, when the circumstances are right and the interests are aligned, evolve into security relationships. That is precisely what happened between Riyadh and Beijing over the decade that followed Abqaiq. The weapons deals came first, and they began earlier than most people realize. In 2017, China and Saudi Arabia signed what was at that time China's largest arms export deal in history. Saudi Arabia ordered Wingloom 2 combat drones from China. These were not training aircraft or surveillance platforms. They were armed, medium altitude, long-endurance unmanned combat systems with precision and strike capability, weapons of war that could be deployed, operated, and maintained entirely outside the American supply chain. No American spare parts, no American technicians, no American ability to condition their sale on Saudi behavior. The deal sent a message that almost nobody in Western media bothered to read carefully at the time. But that was only the beginning. Saudi Arabia was also quietly working on Chinese-supplied ballistic missiles. The DF-21 class systems, long-range, road-mobile, and capable of striking targets across a wide regional radius. Then came joint military exercises between Saudi and Chinese naval forces, then Chinese naval vessels visiting the port of Jeddah, then a research and development center established in Saudi Arabia by China Electronics Technology Group, focused on drone systems, communications, and flight control technology. Then the Huawei 5G infrastructure contracts, signed despite repeated and direct American objections. Then the formal comprehensive strategic partnership announced in December 2022, when Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in person and was treated to a state reception that Saudi Arabia had never offered an American president. The language Beijing used to describe that partnership was precise and deliberate, an epoch-making milestone in the history of China-Arab relations. Beijing does not use language like that casually. And then, in March 2023, the event that truly announced China's arrival as the Gulf's alternate power. China brokered a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that had spent years as regional adversaries, whose rivalry had fueled proxy conflicts from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Iraq, whose diplomats had not spoken directly in years, sat down in Beijing and shook hands. The deal was negotiated entirely without American involvement. Washington was not consulted. Washington was not informed in advance. American diplomats found out from the news, like everyone else. From Beijing's perspective, this was a declaration, not a hostile one, not a military one, but unmistakably a declaration of strategic capability. China was telling the Gulf and telling Washington that it could deliver things that America could not or would not. It could bring enemies to the table. It could create stability without demanding anything in return. It could be the power that the region called when it needed results rather than lectures. Now hold that picture in your mind. Because everything we have just described, the drone deals, the missile systems, the diplomatic breakthrough, the 5G infrastructure, the formal strategic partnership, all of it is the background. All of it is the foundation. What happened this week, in the middle of an active regional war, is something categorically different. Something that elevates this entire relationship to a level that American strategists will be analyzing, debating, and losing sleep over for years. Saudi Arabia has signed a $5 billion agreement with China's Aviation Industry Corporation, known as AVIC, and Saudi Arabia's General Authority for Military Industries, to establish a Wingloom 3 unmanned combat aerial vehicle assembly line in the city of Jeddah. Read that sentence again slowly. This is not a purchase. Saudi Arabia is not buying Chinese drones the way you buy a car. It is building a factory, a weapons factory, in its own territory, using Chinese technology, Chinese designs, Chinese avionics, and Chinese production infrastructure. The facility will manufacture approximately 48 advanced long-range unmanned combat drones per year. The contract includes full technology transfer covering flight control systems and avionics integration. Saudi engineers and pilots will be trained using digital twin virtual simulation systems. A regional logistics hub in Riyadh will stock over 2,000 spare parts with 48-hour deployment capability across all Gulf Cooperation Council member states. Let us talk about the Wing-Lung 3 itself, because the capabilities of this platform explain why this deal is so significant. The Wing-Lung 3 is a medium-altitude, long-endurance combat drone with a range of 10,000 kilometers. It can remain airborne for 40 continuous hours. Its payload capacity is 2,300 kilograms, allowing it to carry a combination of precision weapons, electronic warfare systems, and sensor packages simultaneously. Its intelligent target recognition system can lock onto a target in 3 seconds. Its anti-jamming capability has been improved by 40% compared to earlier models. This is not an experimental platform. It is not a proof of concept. It has been proven in over 200 combat sorties, including operations during the 2025 India-Pakistan conflict, where Wing-Lung 3 aircraft destroyed multiple radar stations and armored vehicles in minutes. Saudi officials selected this specific platform after conducting detailed operational tests with over 200 aircraft in simulated combat exercises. They knew exactly what they were buying and what they were building. But here's the strategic dimension of this deal that goes beyond any single weapon system. When a country builds its military infrastructure with another country's technology embedded at the core, the relationship between those two countries changes permanently. Saudi Arabia is not just acquiring Chinese drones, it is creating a structural, long-term dependency on Chinese military technology that will shape Riyadh's foreign policy for decades. It is creating thousands of Saudi engineers and military officers whose entire professional expertise, their technical knowledge, their career advancement, their institutional identity is built on Chinese platforms. It is creating a situation where, when a crisis arrives, when a conflict erupts, when Saudi Arabia needs technical support, intelligence integration, spare parts, or operational guidance, the first call goes to Beijing. Not Washington, Beijing. And the intelligence implications alone are staggering. Saudi Arabia simultaneously operates American F-15 fighter jets, Patriot missile defense batteries, AWACS surveillance aircraft, and a broad array of American military platforms purchased over decades of the U.S.-Saudi defense relationship. If Chinese technicians are now embedded in Saudi Arabia's defense industrial infrastructure, if Chinese avionics are being integrated into Saudi military networks, if Chinese satellite communication systems are operating alongside American ones, then Beijing gains a passive, structural window into American military systems and capabilities that no espionage operation could replicate. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is basic counterintelligence analysis. And it is something American officials have been warning about in classified briefings for years. Now, while all of this was happening in the background, on the 28th of February 2026, the world changed. Mid-morning on February 28th, the United States Central Command in Israel launched a massive, coordinated military campaign against Iran. The operation was codenamed Operation Epic Fury by the United States and Operation Roaring Lion by Israel. In just the first 12 hours, nearly 900 strikes were conducted, targeting Iranian missiles and air defenses, military infrastructure, naval assets, and Iranian leadership. The stated objectives were clear and unambiguous. Destroy Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure, destroy the remnants of its nuclear program, eliminate IRGC leadership, and induce regime change. The timing of the initial wave, according to U.S. and Israeli officials, was partly determined by the ability to target Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei before he could go into hiding. The intelligence window was open. The decision was made to use it. In the first wave of strikes on February 28th, Khamenei was killed in his compound in the heart of Tehran. Dozens of other top Iranian officials were killed alongside him. The Fars news agency, controlled by the IRGC, subsequently confirmed that Khamenei's daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchild, and his daughter-in-law had all been killed in the same strikes. The man who had ruled the Islamic Republic of Iran with absolute authority for over 3 decades, the figure around whom the entire Iranian power structure was organized, was gone. It is worth pausing for just a moment to understand the full significance of that. Iran's political system is designed around the concept of the supreme leader, not just as a political position, but as a theological one. The supreme leader is not simply a head of state. He is the representative of the hidden imam, the religious legitimation for the entire Islamic Republic. Killing Khamenei was not like killing a president or a prime minister. It was more like, from the Iranian system's perspective, decapitating the very concept of the state itself. Iran's constitution calls for an interim leadership council to take over until a new supreme leader can be selected. That council was established on March 1st. but just hours after its formation, Iran's foreign minister said publicly that nobody knew who the next supreme leader would be. The Assembly of Experts, the body responsible for selecting the new leader, had its meeting place destroyed by Israeli strikes on March 3rd. On March 8th, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain supreme leader, was elected to replace his father, a dynastic succession in a republic that explicitly prohibits dynasticism. The irony was not lost on anyone watching. Iran's response was designated Operation True Promise 4, and it was immediate, massive, and deliberately targeted not just at the countries that attacked it, but at every country in the region that housed American military forces, which meant almost everyone. Within hours of the opening strikes, Iran launched waves of ballistic missiles and armed drones targeting Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Azerbaijan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. By March 5th, according to a military source speaking to the Fars news agency, Iran had fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since February 28th. Approximately 40% of those launches were directed at Israel. Approximately 60% were directed at U.S. military targets across the region. The strategic logic behind hitting the Gulf states was as deliberate as it was devastating. Iran was not striking randomly. It was implementing a doctrine it had communicated clearly for years, that any country hosting American military forces that are used to attack Iran will be treated as a co-belligerent. From Tehran's perspective, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, the air assets at Al Udeid in Qatar, the logistics infrastructure in Kuwait and the UAE, these were all components of the same military machine that had just killed its supreme leader. The Gulf states had not fired a single shot, but their territory had been used, and in Iran's doctrine that made their territory legitimate targets. The IRGC said so explicitly. All U.S. assets throughout the region are considered legitimate targets. This operation will continue relentlessly until the enemy is decisively defeated. That statement was not bluster. It was operational guidance followed by action. The Gulf kingdoms, despite everything they had done to avoid becoming a battleground, had become a battleground. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain's Jaffair district was struck multiple times by Iranian missiles. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest and most economically vital airports on the entire planet, was damaged by drone strikes, temporarily halting all flights and reopening only at limited capacity days later. Kuwait's U.S. embassy was hit by an Iranian missile strike, prompting Secretary of State Rubio to close the embassy until further notice. A Kuwaiti F-A-18 shot down 3 American F-15Es in a friendly fire incident, with all 6 crew members surviving. Qatar's energy infrastructure was targeted by Iranian drones. The IRGC statement was brief and direct. All U.S. assets throughout the region are considered legitimate targets. This operation will continue relentlessly until the enemy is decisively defeated. And then, on March 2nd, an IRGC commander transmitted a message directly to the International Maritime Distress Frequency, the channel that every ship in the region monitors continuously. The message said the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. According to Cormac McGarry, the Director of Maritime Intelligence at Control Risks, every ship in the area heard that message simultaneously, and that was enough. Not a single additional action was required. The threat alone was sufficient to effectively shut down the world's most important energy corridor. Now we need to talk about the Strait of Hormuz in detail, because everything that has happened in global markets over the past week is a direct consequence of this single geographic reality, and you cannot understand the true stakes of this crisis without understanding the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean beyond. At its narrowest point, it is 33 kilometers wide. The actual shipping lanes are far narrower. There are 2 lanes of approximately 3 kilometers each, one for inbound traffic and one for outbound. Through those combined 6 kilometers of navigable water, approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, this represents roughly 20% of total global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 27% of global seaborne oil trade. Through this same channel passes approximately 20% of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply, almost all of it from Qatar. China, India, Japan, and South Korea, the 4 largest oil importing economies in Asia, collectively account for 69% of all crude oil and condensate flows through the strait. Japan obtains the vast majority of its crude from Gulf producers. South Korea does the same. These are not marginal dependencies. These are fundamental existential dependencies. When the IRGC declared the strait closed and the maritime insurance market responded, the consequences materialized in hours, not days. UK maritime trade operations issued emergency warnings. Maersk, the world's largest shipping company, announced it was pausing all vessel crossings through the strait until further notice, rerouting its ships via the Cape of Good Hope, a journey that adds weeks to transit times and billions to shipping costs. Protection and indemnity insurance, the essential coverage without which no shipowner or charterer can legally operate a commercial vessel in a conflict zone, was withdrawn entirely for the Strait of Hormuz. Without that insurance, it is commercially and legally impossible to send a ship through. The result was that the strait did not need to be physically blocked. Iran did not need to mine the channel or position warships across the lanes. The threat alone, combined with the attack on 5 tankers and the killing of 2 maritime personnel, was sufficient to create a de facto closure for virtually all commercial shipping. Vessel tracking service. Kepler confirmed that limited traffic continued through the strait, primarily ships flying Iranian and Chinese flags. Everyone else stopped. 150 tankers anchored in open waters outside the strait and waited. The world's oil supply, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, all of it was trapped. The oil existed, the tankers existed, the refinery demand existed, but the doorway was shut. The market reaction was the most violent energy price movement in modern history. Global oil prices surged more than 25% from the start of the war, pushing the national average gasoline price in the United States to $3, 41 per gallon by March 8th, a jump of 43 cents in a single week. Brent crude futures reached as high as $83 per barrel in the first days, with Goldman Sachs research calculating that traders were demanding approximately $14 more per barrel than before the conflict simply to compensate for the risk premium. An estimate, Goldman said, roughly corresponded to a full 4-week halt in Strait of Hormuz flows. In a full closure scenario without any offsets from spare pipeline capacity or strategic reserve releases, Goldman estimated prices could rise $15 per barrel on top of the pre-war baseline. JP Morgan analysts warned that if the strait remained effectively closed, production cuts could exceed 4 million barrels per day. The Stimson Center calculated that a serious Hormuz disruption could remove 8 million to 10 million barrels per day from world supply, even accounting for partial rerouting through Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline and Abu Dhabi's export routes. European natural gas futures jumped approximately 30% following the attacks on Qatar's infrastructure and Qatar Energy's announcement that it was halting production at its 2 main facilities, the Ras Laffan Industrial City and the Mesaieed Industrial City. These are not peripheral facilities. Ras Laffan is the single most important LNG export terminal on Earth. Its closure does not merely disrupt gas supplies for European homes. It disrupts the feedstock for nitrogen-based fertilizers, which means it threatens global food production. Daily freight rates for LNG tankers jumped more than 40% in a single Monday. South Korea, which imports 20% of its gas from the region, announced that it could run out of LNG in 9 days. The South Korean president created a 100 trillion won, approximately $68 billion emergency stabilization fund to cope with the energy crisis. European natural gas futures, which had been trading at around $31 per MW before the war, were projected by Goldman Sachs to potentially exceed $100 per MW if LNG flows through the strait were fully halted for more than 2 months. And here's the number that captures the full scale of what has happened. A nearly complete shutdown of the strait means the region's top producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait, have had to suspend shipments of as much as 140 million barrels of oil, equal to approximately 4 days of total global demand to refineries around the world. That is not a disruption. That is a suspension of the global energy supply system. The world has never seen a disruption of this scale in the modern era of global energy markets. Let us put that in human terms, because abstract numbers about barrels per day do not capture what this actually means for the people watching this video. When oil prices rise 25% in a week, gasoline prices rise at every pump in every country on Earth that buys crude on global markets. The United States saw its national average gasoline price hit $3, 41 per gallon by March 8th, up 43 cents in a single week. In Europe, where gasoline taxes are higher and the currency exposure is different, the pain is even sharper. In emerging market economies, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Egypt, countries where fuel costs represent a far larger share of household income than they do in wealthy nations, the impact is not inconvenient. It is devastating. India imports approximately 70% of its crude oil and depends heavily on Gulf suppliers. Every dollar rise in the oil price costs India billions in additional import expenses and puts pressure on the rupee simultaneously. Egypt, which was already managing a fragile economic recovery, faces higher import costs for fuel and food simultaneously, since fertilizer prices are rising in tandem with LNG disruptions. The shipping disruption compounds all of this. About 10% of the world's container ships are currently caught in the broader backlogs created by the Strait closure and the general conflict zone warnings across the Gulf region, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. Cargo is starting to pile up at ports and transshipment hubs across Europe and Asia. More than 80% of global trade moves by sea. When the sea lanes through the most important region in global trade are compromised, delivery times lengthen, inventory costs rise, just-in-time supply chains break down, and businesses everywhere absorb higher costs that ultimately get passed on to consumers. The Stimson Center analysts put it clearly: the conflict can raise costs through more than one channel at once because the Gulf is not only where oil comes from, it is also the world's most important aviation and logistics bridge between Europe and Asia. That bridge is currently on fire. Italy's intelligence services have warned that if the instability spreads into the broader eastern Mediterranean, the effects on energy markets and supply security across Mediterranean countries and Europe as a whole could be systemic, particularly if Iran's allied Houthi movement in Yemen resumes its Red Sea shipping attacks in solidarity with Tehran. Djibouti's finance minister issued a public warning that the fighting would bring severe economic consequences for developing countries. Small states dependent on maritime trade, his statement read, risk being pulled into deeper economic uncertainty as external shocks ripple across the region. These are not wealthy countries with strategic petroleum reserves and sovereign wealth funds to absorb the shock. These are countries living paycheck to paycheck at the national level, and a sustained energy disruption of this magnitude could tip them into genuine crisis. Now let us return to the question that began this entire story. What was in MBS's call to Beijing? And what does the Wing Lung 3 deal signed this week in the middle of this war mean for everything we have just described? Here is what we know from the intelligence picture that has emerged. From the very first hours of the conflict, China's position was not neutral. Beijing called the Iranian foreign minister and expressed support for Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity. China called on the United States and Israel to immediately halt military operations. Chinese state media framed the conflict consistently as American aggression. And critically, on March 2nd, the same day the Strait was declared closed, vessel tracking data from KPLR confirmed what maritime intelligence analysts had suspected. Iranian and Chinese-flagged vessels continued moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Limited traffic, but not zero. The Strait was closed to everyone except the ships of Iran's most important economic partner and political ally. This was not an accident. This was a statement. Iran, even in the most catastrophic crisis in its modern history, with its supreme leader dead and its military under sustained bombardment, was still finding ways to signal to the world who its real allies were. Chinese ships moved. Everyone else's ships were burning. Beijing, for its part, was managing something more sophisticated than even most expert observers understood. Because China's strategy in the Gulf is not the same as America's strategy. Washington's approach has been based on military presence, on force projection, on the ability to intimidate adversaries and coerce allies through the credible threat of violence. China's approach is fundamentally different. Beijing does not seek to replace the United States militarily. Not yet. Not in a confrontational, direct, my carrier versus your carrier way. What China seeks is something more lasting and ultimately more powerful. It seeks to become indispensable, to become the country that every regional power calls when it needs something that America cannot or will not provide, to become the partner that never lectures about human rights, never cancels a contract because of a newspaper editorial, never makes its security assistance conditional on domestic political reforms. And there is a crucial second layer to China's strategy that almost never gets discussed in Western media coverage of this conflict. China is simultaneously the world's largest importer of Gulf oil and the primary financial lifeline for Iran, the country that has just closed the strait that its oil comes through. This looks paradoxical at first glance. Why would China support Iran's closure of the strait if Chinese ships need Gulf oil to flow? The answer reveals the extraordinary sophistication of Beijing's position. Chinese ships are still moving through the strait, limited traffic, but moving. Iran is making an exception for its most important ally and economic partner. This arrangement serves China's interests perfectly. It gets continued energy supply. It demonstrates to every Gulf state watching that a relationship with Beijing provides tangible, operational benefits in exactly the moments that matter most. And it positions China as the one major power that has relationships on all sides simultaneously, making Beijing the only credible mediator when the time comes to end this conflict. Think about what that means in terms of leverage. When the shooting eventually stops, and every war eventually stops, who will the parties call? Iran will call Beijing, because China is the only major power Iran trusts. Saudi Arabia will call Beijing, because Beijing just proved its ships can move through a closed strait. The UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, all of them have seen what a strategic relationship with Beijing actually delivers in practice. And the United States, the country that started this war without consulting anyone, that launched Operation Epic Fury without a formal congressional declaration, without warning its Gulf partners, without providing any credible mechanism for protecting them from the consequences, the United States will come to the negotiating table as the party seeking to end a crisis it created. And China will come to that table as the indispensable mediator. That is Beijing's masterstroke. Think about what that means in practice. China can call Tehran because it has been Iran's largest oil customer for years, purchasing sanctioned Iranian crude at a discount and keeping the Islamic Republic financially viable through periods of maximum American pressure. Without that Chinese demand for Iranian oil, Iran's economy would have collapsed years ago. When Iran needs to communicate with a major power that it trusts, it calls Beijing. China can call Riyadh because Saudi Arabia just signed a $5 billion deal to build Chinese combat drones inside its own borders. When Saudi Arabia needs technical military support, when it needs systems that work without American permission, it will call Beijing. China can call Abu Dhabi because Chinese investment permeates Dubai's financial sector, and the Belt and Road infrastructure projects connect Gulf ports directly to Chinese supply chains. China can call the entire Gulf simultaneously as the neutral party, as the deal maker, as the power that brokered the 2023 normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as the country whose ships are the only ones moving freely through a strait that is closed to the world. America, by contrast, started this war. Operation Epic Fury was a U.S.-Israeli decision. The Gulf states were not consulted in any meaningful way. They were not asked for their consent. They were simply told after the fact that their territory was now a front line. Oman had been mediating indirect talks between Washington and Tehran just days before the strikes began. On February 25th, Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi said publicly that a historic agreement to avert military conflict was within reach. On February 27th, Oman's Foreign Minister said a breakthrough had been reached, with Iran agreeing to never stockpile enriched uranium and to full IAEA verification. Peace was, according to the people directly involved in the negotiations, within reach. Then the bombs fell. The Gulf states watched their airports get struck, their water desalination plants hit, their oil infrastructure targeted, their civilian populations forced into shelters, all because they had allowed American forces to operate from their soil, and Washington had made a military decision without asking whether they were ready for the consequences. The UAE recalled its ambassador to Israel in a signal of diplomatic fury that was impossible to misread. Kuwait issued formal statements asserting its right to defend itself. Qatar condemned Iranian strikes on its territory as a blatant violation of sovereignty, while simultaneously watching Washington refuse to declare any ceasefire. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed that Iranian attacks had targeted both Riyadh and the eastern province, home to the kingdom's most critical oil infrastructure and one of its primary air bases. These are not the responses of countries that feel protected by their ally. These are the responses of countries that have been used. And in that moment, Mohammed bin Salman made a calculation. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was the calculation of a man who has been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. He looked at the $5 billion drone factory being built in Jeddah, at the Chinese ships moving through the closed strait, at the 2023 normalization deal Beijing had delivered, at the formal strategic partnership signed in December 2022, and at the American carrier groups that sat in the Gulf while Iran struck his country's airports and oil fields. And he made a decision about which relationship was actually delivering results. What must be understood clearly is what MBS's choice actually represents. He is not choosing China over America in the way a child chooses between two options on a menu. He is doing something more sophisticated and ultimately far more consequential for American global power. He is choosing to need America less. That distinction is profound. Every Winglong 3 drone built in Jeddah using Chinese technology is a weapon that does not require an American export license, does not depend on American spare parts, cannot be sanctioned or embargoed by a vote in the U.S. Congress, and cannot be conditioned on Saudi Arabia behaving in ways that satisfy American domestic political pressures. Every barrel of oil priced or traded outside the petrodollar system is a barrel that does not require American financial infrastructure. Every 5G network built on Huawei equipment is a communications backbone that does not run through American technology companies, subject to American government oversight. Saudi Arabia is building autonomy, not hostility. Autonomy. The ability to operate, defend itself, trade, and pursue its national interests without requiring American permission at every step. And that process, once it reaches a certain threshold, is essentially irreversible. You cannot unbuild a drone factory. You cannot untrain 10,000 Saudi engineers on Chinese avionics systems. You cannot unsign a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. The structural dependencies, once created, persist and deepen regardless of which American president is in office or what arms package Washington offers. The Trump administration came to power promising to go all in on the U.S.-Saudi relationship. It approved the prospect of F-35 sales to the kingdom as a signature gesture of strategic commitment. But the price of the real relationship MBS wanted was not weapons. It was a formal, Senate-ratified, legally binding security treaty with explicit guarantees, the kind of guarantee that would bind the United States to defend Saudi Arabia with the same legal automaticity that Article 5 of NATO binds the alliance to defend any member. Washington could not deliver that. It would not deliver that. And in the absence of that guarantee, All the F-35s in the world did not close the gap between what America was offering and what Saudi Arabia needed. The relationship drifted, and Beijing filled the space. Now let us look at what comes next. Because this situation is not static. It is evolving hour by hour, and the trajectory matters enormously. On the military front, U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran have continued day after day. CENTCOM confirmed on March 5th that it had struck nearly 2,000 targets in Iran since February 28th. The IDF completed its 12th wave of strikes on Tehran on March 5th, hitting IRGC facilities, besieged organization headquarters, and command centers throughout the capital and surrounding provinces. A U.S. military submarine struck and sank the Iris Dana, Iran's most modern Mauj-class frigate, 40 nautical miles off the coast of Sri Lanka on March 4th, marking the first Iranian warship sunk in the Indian Ocean during this conflict, and demonstrating that Operation Epic Fury had expanded geographically far beyond the Middle East, theater most analysts had anticipated. The rate of Iranian ballistic missile launches has declined since the opening days of the war, with analysts citing both a depletion of Iranian missile stocks and a deliberate strategy of conserving remaining capabilities for a longer campaign. Iran has said publicly it has not asked for a ceasefire. Foreign Minister Araghchi told NBC News directly, "We did not ask for a ceasefire even last time." In previous conflicts, it was Israel who asked for an unconditional ceasefire after 12 days of resistance. This time, Iran's position is that it can absorb punishment indefinitely while continuing to impose economic costs on the entire world through the Strait closure. That assessment may or may not be correct militarily, but economically, the strategy is working. Every day the Strait remains effectively closed costs the global economy an amount that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but is certainly measured in tens of billions of dollars. The disruption to supply chains extends far beyond energy. About 10% of the world's container ships are caught up in broader shipping backlogs. Cargo is piling up at ports across Europe and Asia. More than 80% of global trade moves by sea, and every route touching the Gulf is compromised. Now here is the question that nobody in Washington has a comfortable answer to. What happens if this does not end quickly? What happens if Iran, battered as it is, continues to hold the Strait effectively closed for weeks rather than days? Goldman Sachs has already modeled what a full 2-month closure of LNG flows through the Strait would do to European gas prices. Over 100 euros per megawatt hour, Europe would face energy rationing in winter. Germany's industrial base, already weakened by years of energy policy disruption, could face factory shutdowns at a scale not seen since the 1970s. Japan, entirely dependent on imported energy, would face an economic crisis that its central bank has almost no tools left to address. The cascading effect on global manufacturing, on supply chains, on inflation, on interest rates, on debt markets and emerging economies, already burdened by dollar-denominated borrowing, all of it accumulates into a scenario that the word recession does not adequately describe. And that is before we consider the wild card: Russia. Moscow has been watching this conflict with great interest. Russia is also a major oil producer. Every dollar rise in the oil price due to the Strait closure is a dollar that flows into Russian coffers, partially offsetting the impact of Western sanctions. Russia and China are co-architects of the emerging multipolar order. They consult constantly. They coordinate, if not always openly. If the conflict draws Iran, Russia, and China into an aligned posture against the American-led response, the framework of great power competition shifts in ways that go beyond anything the current crisis has produced. Italy's intelligence agencies have already warned about Greek-Turkish tensions escalating in the eastern Mediterranean, as both countries maneuver in response to the broader instability. The arc of potential escalation runs from Jeddah to Delhi, from Hormuz to the South China Sea, and the interconnections are not hypothetical. They are structural. For Gulf states themselves, the picture is deeply uncomfortable. Their air defense systems have performed well. The UAE reported high interception rates against incoming drones and ballistic missiles. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar all intercepted large numbers of Iranian projectiles. American investment in integrated Gulf air defense is paying operational dividends, but operational success on the battlefield has not produced political satisfaction. These countries remain caught between two competing catastrophes: the continued Iranian strikes on their soil and the American war that triggered those strikes without asking their permission. The economic damage to the Gulf kingdoms themselves is severe. Iraq's 3 main southern oil fields, which before this war produced over 4 million barrels per day, have seen output fall 70%. The UAE is carefully managing offshore production levels, a diplomatic phrase that means cutting output. Kuwait has made precautionary cuts. Saudi Arabia's own facilities in the eastern province have been targeted. The global oil supply shock is, paradoxically, hurting the countries that produce the oil as much as it is hurting the countries that consume it, because all of that oil is sitting in storage, in pipelines, on tankers at anchor, unable to move to market. And now we arrive at the final revelation, the one this entire video has been building toward, the one that reframes everything. The United States did not lose the Gulf this week. It began losing the Gulf years ago across a long sequence of decisions and non-decisions that accumulated slowly, then suddenly. The loss began in 2019 when a break was struck and Washington did nothing. It deepened in 2023 when China brokered the Iran-Saudi normalization deal and American diplomats read about it in the news. It accelerated with every annual cycle in which Washington demanded conditions for security guarantees while Beijing offered partnership without conditions. And it was formalized in the most concrete, irreversible industrial terms possible when Saudi Arabia signed a $5 billion deal to build Chinese combat drones in Jeddah during an active regional war, while American carrier strike groups sat over the horizon. But here is the deepest layer of this story, the thing that goes beyond any single deal or any single diplomatic failure. What is happening in the Gulf right now is the most visible manifestation of a global structural shift that has been underway for a decade and is now accelerating beyond the ability of any single country to reverse. The world is transitioning from the unipolar order that emerged from the end of the Cold War, the order organized around American military, financial, and institutional power, to a multipolar order where multiple major powers exercise genuine autonomy across different domains and different regions. That transition has been gradual, and its advocates and opponents have argued about it in academic journals and policy conferences for years. But transitions that proceed gradually often reach a moment when they suddenly become visible to everyone simultaneously. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the $5 billion drone factory in Jeddah, the Chinese ships moving freely where American ones cannot, these are the visibility event. This is the moment when the abstract geopolitical shift becomes a concrete reality that affects fuel prices and food costs for billions of ordinary people around the world. China understands this transition better than any other country. Beijing has watched the American-led order function and has calculated, with great precision, that the most effective way to displace it is not military confrontation, but structural substitution. Replace American technology with Chinese technology in enough critical systems. Replace American financial infrastructure with Chinese alternatives in enough critical transactions. Replace American diplomatic leadership with Chinese mediation in enough critical disputes. Do all of this slowly, patiently, without triggering the defensive response that a direct military challenge would provoke. And eventually, the American-centered order does not collapse under military pressure. It quietly becomes irrelevant in the regions and relationships where it has been successfully substituted. The $5 billion drone factory in Jeddah is not simply a weapons deal. It is structural substitution in the defense domain. The 2023 Iran-Saudi normalization is structural substitution in the diplomatic domain. The Huawei 5G infrastructure is structural substitution in the communications domain. The petroleum transactions and Aramco Chinese refinery investments are structural substitution in the financial domain. Each individual element looks manageable. Each one generates a specific Washington response, a warning, a sanction threat, a diplomatic protest. But the cumulative effect of all of them together, playing out simultaneously across multiple domains over a decade, is the strategic picture we see today. A Gulf in which Chinese ships move freely through a closed strait, in which the most important Arab kingdom is building Chinese weapons in its own territory, and in which the phone call that matters most is not the one to the Oval Office, but the one to Beijing. There is one final point that must be made clearly, because it is the honest conclusion of everything we have examined. The United States Navy has not left the Gulf. The carriers are still there. American F-35s and B-2 stealth bombers are still flying sorties. In a direct military confrontation with any adversary, American military power would still prevail. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute, what has in fact already been decided, is whether American military dominance translates automatically into the kind of strategic leverage over Gulf state decisions that Washington has taken for granted since 1945. And the answer to that question, today, on the 9th of March, 2026, as 150 tankers sit at anchor outside a closed strait and a drone factory opens in Jeddah, is clearly no. Military dominance and strategic indispensability are not the same thing, and it is the latter, not the former, that America has lost. MBS's call to Beijing was not a betrayal. It was not a sudden act of anger or defiance. It was the logical, inevitable destination of a journey that began years ago and proceeded with remarkable consistency, regardless of who was sitting in the White House. When the Crown Prince looked at everything China had delivered and everything America had failed to deliver, and when he looked at his country's airports and oil fields being struck while American carriers sat in the Gulf they were supposed to be protecting, he made the only decision that made strategic sense for the kingdom he will rule for the next 50 years. He called Beijing. And what they agreed on was simply this: China will be Saudi Arabia's partner of first resort for defense technology, for energy trade, for diplomatic mediation, and for the long-term construction of a regional order that does not require American permission to exist. The U.S. Navy has not been replaced in the Persian Gulf in a military sense, but it has been replaced as the indispensable foundation of Gulf security. It has been replaced as the only game in town, and that replacement did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in boardrooms and technology transfer agreements and normalization deals, in infrastructure contracts and digital twin training simulators at a drone factory in Jeddah. It happened quietly, patiently, and so gradually that Washington did not see it clearly until the moment it was complete. The world you're watching right now, with oil prices spiking, with the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, with Chinese ships moving freely where American ones cannot, with a $5 billion Chinese drone factory being assembled in Saudi Arabia during an active regional war, this is the world that phone call built. And the question that every serious strategist in Washington, London, and every other capital that has staked its security on the American-led order is now asking, quietly, urgently, and without a satisfying answer, is whether we have already passed the point where that trajectory can be changed, or whether the call has been made, the deal has been signed, the factory is being built, and the world has already moved on. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening beneath the headlines and the most consequential geopolitical story of our time, share it with someone who needs to understand it. The mainstream news will show you the explosions. This channel will show you the real strategy underneath the strategy. That is exactly what we are here for.